Hello, everyone. You are listening to the first ever broadcast, the official Greener New England podcast. Hey, that rhymed. I'm your host, David, along with X2 on this pleasant day. The time is 12 p.m., which means it is time to start the show. How are you doing today, X2? Tired. I planned on getting my COVID 19 shot next week, though. Really? Well, that's good. I just got mine yesterday, and my left arm has been feeling sore for several hours. Usually that goes away within a day or something like that. Man, I'm glad this whole COVID thing's almost over. Or, at least it kind of feels like that. I know. I can finally begin to go out to the beach without worrying about getting sick. Not to mention, you get sick, and then you might get your friends sick, and you get your family sick, and the whole thing just becomes a huge mess. Yeah, well, we've talked about non-green stuff for long enough, so let us get on with today's episode. So I'm going to click a plan. We have an interesting topic for today, folks. Air pollution. More specifically, how ozone air pollution has been decreasing in New England, with one main exception. Now, before we get started, X2, can you explain what this one exception is? Is it Massachusetts? Good guess, but no. It's Connecticut, believe it or not. Really? Connecticut? I was thinking it would be Massachusetts due to their population and high tourism. Well, there is a very surprising explanation for this. Before we get to that, let's go over what we mean by ozone air pollution has been decreasing in New England. You can't see my air quotes, but I am doing them. X2, could you pull up the article by the EPA? Sure thing. Let's see now. The one titled New England experienced fewer unhealthy air quality days during the 2020 ozone season? Yes, that is the one. So, let's first define what ground ozone is. Or, more accurately, let's provide the definition given by the EPA as to what ground ozone is. The definition given by the EPA is that ground level ozone forms when volatile organic compounds and oxides of nitrogen chemically react in the presence of sunlight. In other words, folks, it's bad stuff. Yeah, more or less. The EPA warns that this ozone is harmful to breathe. It aggressively attacks lung tissue by reacting chemically to it. When ground ozone is present, other harmful pollutants can be created. Here in New England, cars and trucks give off the majority of the pollution that makes ozone. According to the EPA, it seems we, as New Englanders, are seeing some good news in terms of bad ozone days. So it seems. As you can see, well, you can't, but we're going to go over it anyways. The article states that overall, there were 23 unhealthy ozone days in New England in 2019. Meanwhile, in 2020, there were only 18 unhealthy ozone days, a result of what the article calls a cool, wet spring. Yeah, I'm just looking at the results of the different states, and the thing that pops out is the fact that Connecticut had 17 bad days, which was still less than the 20 bad days the state had a year prior. Yeah, that is rather interesting. Something to note for our listeners at home. 17 days doesn't sound like a whole lot, but um, when you think about it, that's still half a month, and ground ozone level rises in response to rising temperatures. In other words, ground ozone would be at its worst in summer, and as we all know, here in New England, summer only lasts for 3 months. And that leads us to our next article that talks about Connecticut's ozone pollution. It's an article by CT Post titled Connecticut Ozone Pollution Among Worst in U.S., which covers the condition of Connecticut back in 2019. If you want to know how bad Connecticut had it back in 2019, it was, according to the article, ranked 10th worst in terms of ozone pollution out of all U.S. states. Now, something that was on my mind when I heard that Connecticut has very strict air pollution standards was um, why is Connecticut struggling with such ozone pollution when they have these air pollution standards to begin with? Well, the article actually does explain this. The article says that the cause of Connecticut's air pollution is that Connecticut is downwind of polluting power plants in Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. All these states that I just listed have failed to provide ozone reduction plans, which was discovered back in 2015. Before we began today's podcast, I actually did hear about how Connecticut sued the EPA over the enforcement of pollution, or I should say, more accurately, the lack of enforcement by the EPA from Midwestern power plants back in 2018, so a year prior to what the article is describing. So, now that I did some research, it does give context to the story that I heard about a while back. I know that New York is also hit by this current of ozone pollution. If we were to look at a map, one can see that Connecticut doesn't get much of a blockade, if you will, from New York. So that explains why Connecticut is hit harder than other New England states such as Vermont or Rhode Island. In fact, Connecticut itself acts as a blockade for Rhode Island. One thing before we continue is that we will sometimes refer to ozone pollution as air pollution. Just pointing that out to lessen any confusion that you listeners at home may have. You know something funny? I'm reading the article as we're talking, right? And I found something rather interesting. What is it? So, as you know, Connecticut has been struggling with ozone pollution, but they have been doing a good job of keeping particle pollution in check. It would seem then that I guess their strict air pollution standards have shown to be useful to some extent. Indeed. Now, to everyone at home who doesn't know what particle pollution is, I'll quickly go over it. The CT Post defines particle pollution as referring to the microscopic particles that can burrow deep within the lungs, triggering asthma, heart attacks, stroke, and lung cancer. Yes, and for those who are wondering, particle pollution originates from a mix of ash, soot, diesel oxides, chemicals, metals, and aerosols. And so, this brings us to our final article of the day, which is by the American Lung Association titled Connecticut's air quality earned straight Fs for ozone despite improvements, finds 2020 State of Air Report, which covers the most recent air pollution report on Connecticut. Right. So it says that the American Lung Association gave Connecticut failing grades for ozone pollution despite marginally less unhealthy days. I was wondering that since this report is from 2020, would COVID-19 have any relationship with Connecticut's air pollution problem? In a way, there is one. The article states that Connecticut's ozone pollution placed the health of its residents at risk, including those who are more vulnerable to the effects of air pollution, such as older adults, children, and those with lung disease. These also happen to be the same demographics that are most at risk from the effects of COVID-19. Out of curiosity, what about the particle pollution in 2020? In the previous article, it stated how Connecticut seemed to have the situation under control. Do they still have it under control, or has the situation gotten worse? That is a very good question, actually. I was wondering the same thing myself. The article states that the particle pollution level has remained unchanged from last year. So they do, in fact, have that under control, at least for now. And yet, ozone pollution is still a problem, correct? Exactly. So that that ends our discussion with the articles. So we'll be back in just a second. And we are back. Just like David said, uh, that was the conclusion of our article discussion, and that means it's time for our post article discussion. So I just want to give my personal thoughts out first. For starters, that must suck for um, Connecticut, for the people living in Connecticut. I mean, it's one thing that you have a mess that you made yourself, and then it's a completely different can of worms when the mess is someone else made it, and it makes it seem like you're the one at fault. And I think that because the main culprit of Connecticut's ozone pollution comes from other states that we mentioned, like Illinois, for example, it's going to make it harder for Connecticut to deal with the problem since it comes from an outside source. Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. Um, Although I would like to mention that even though most of Connecticut's ozone pollution comes from other states, let's not get the idea that Connecticut is 100% innocent, as I am sure they deserve at least some of the blame. Um, One other thing I'd like to mention is that I personally don't see this ozone pollution problem going away anytime soon. This is mostly because of global warming, which is a major concern here in New England. Yeah, now that you mention it, you know what this reminds me of? Um, what X2? On our Greener New England website, do you remember that forest section that talks about the relationship between humans and forests? Yes. Well, if you recall, we at Greener New England talked about how deforestation has led to higher temperatures, which led to higher ground ozone layers. Yes, that is very much true. Um, if anyone at home wants to read more about environmental relationships between animals, humans, and global warming, I strongly recommend that you check out our website at greenernewengland.com. That's greener underscore new underscore england.com. And getting back to the topic at hand, um, I believe that one of our goals here at Greener New England is to make these connections, to see how one thing is related to another. So we are connecting the topic of Connecticut's ozone pollution, and we are seeing how this topic is connected to what is discussed at the Greener New England website. And I think that's important in environmentalism to make such connections to better understand specific or more broader issues. Um, Another example I think off the top of my head is how rising temperatures will also increase the rate of Lyme disease due to the increase of deer populations. So rising temperatures will not only increase ground ozone levels, but it will also increase the rate of Lyme disease. Yeah, Connecticut's going to have it rough in the next several years. I mean, can you imagine that? Air pollution from other states and Lyme disease. That must be rough indeed. Yeah. Uh, there's something that I've been thinking for a while. So, I know that Connecticut sued the EPA back in 2018, like we previously discussed. Yeah, yeah. So, I am sitting here wondering, is the federal government not doing anything about this issue? Well, funny thing that you mentioned that, because one thing that I forgot to mention in our discussion on the second article, the one from the CT Post, as you recall, yeah, uh, there is something very interesting that that I found. It's a statement from William Tung, who is the Attorney General for the state of Connecticut. So I'm just going to paraphrase what he said, but basically, in a nutshell, he says that the now former Trump administration allowed pollution to leak into the state of Connecticut. That is indeed a very bold statement to make, but there is some validity to back such a statement. Statement from William Tung, who is the Attorney General for the state of Connecticut. So I'm just going to paraphrase what he said, but basically, in a nutshell, he says that the now former Trump administration allowed pollution to leak into the state of Connecticut. That is indeed a very bold statement to make, but there is some validity to back such a statement. The Trump administration cut back on a ton of environmental regulations. I do wonder, since now it is the year 2021, how would President Joe Biden respond to this problem, if he even does so to begin with? I have not seen or heard anything saying that Joe Biden has addressed or plans to address this issue, but it is one thing to look out for. I would imagine it might be a strong possibility that he does address this issue, since one of his campaign statements was that he wanted to fight back against climate change. Of course, there's no guarantee he helps Connecticut, nor do we know the true and full extent of his plan to fight back against global warming. As we all know, it's easier to make promises on stage, but executing them is another thing entirely. Right, right. I also want to ask you one question before we leave. Uh, how would you go about solving this problem X2? Well, I think that the most important thing to do is to talk to members of these states, talk to the EPA, and possibly even talk to the federal government and go, hey, we're suffering because we are getting air pollution from these other states who don't have strict air pollution rules, so it's not fair that we have to try and clean up after them. I would also try and combat the problem back home. Securing more forested areas and planting more trees should lessen the effect on both ozone pollution and rising temperatures. I do think you have some good suggestions. My only issue is that time would play a factor here. Now, a lawsuit has been filed a while back, as we discussed. However, these things do take time. I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket and would rather look for solutions that could be implemented either now or in the distant future. I do like the idea of planting trees, but again, I'm not too sure how long it would take to establish more conservation lands within Connecticut and plant trees and wait for said trees to reach maturity. Not to mention that you would have to consider potential threats from the outside sources such as gypsy moths, which will be covered in a future episode, so stay tuned for that. Um, Normally, I wouldn't um, worry too much about longer projects, but I do feel that the risk of air pollution is elevated by the fact that we are currently in a pandemic, and that said pandemic attacks our respiratory systems. I think you made some good points, but I don't think it's necessary to focus on the distant future all that much. I feel that this issue is just too big, where I believe that methods that would indeed take up more time to be implemented is needed. Most environmental issues aren't solved in a day, after all, and do require a lot of time. And that is indeed the danger of environmental damage, is that it's so easy to break the environment, but it is much harder to repair. I do understand the need for quicker alternatives due to the current virus outbreak that is going on. However, I feel it is that is even more of a reason for this country to invest in more vaccine production and for people to continue to follow COVID guidelines. If enough people are following health guidelines and are vaccinated in Connecticut, then there wouldn't be a need to rush air pollution policies, and we could establish better policies that will protect Connecticut for years to come. Well, folks, that is all the time we have for today. Tune in next week where we will discuss climate change, changing Rhode Island's marine life. Oh, that should be an interesting one. Yes, indeed. Don't forget to check out our website, greenernewengland.com. That is greener_new_england.com. Our Instagram page is at greenernewengland. That is at greener_new_england. And our Snapchat is greenerNE. That is greener_NE. Anyways, thank you for tuning in.